Good evening. I'm Manfred, Philipp, host for this evening's event on combating anti-Semitism on college campuses. Let me first give credit to the people and organizations that have made this event possible. First, I'd like to thank those who have sponsored this event and helped people become aware of it. These are, in no particular order, the CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, Hillel at a number of colleges, including CUNY's Baruch, City, John Jay, and Queens College, as well as Hillel at Pace University and Fordham Universities, as well as Hillel at Fashion Institute of Technology, the New School, and the School of Visual Arts. Also sponsoring are the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and Sciences and the Bell Zeller Scholarship Trust Fund. Also, George Washington University's Rabin Chair Forum. I'd like to thank the University Faculty Senate of CUNY for also helping publicize this event inside the university. Now, let me get to the people who are making this event possible. First is Ilya Bratman, Executive Director of Hillel at Baruch College. I thank him for all he's done for this event, including soliciting sponsors, setting up the Zoom webinar itself, including at this very moment, and arranging for the event's registration. Ilya is going to handle the technical side of the event this evening. You should submit your questions to him at the web address, that email address that he gave you when you registered for this event. This is ilya@baruchhillel.org. I'd also like to thank Azriel Ganak, who's Distinguished Professor of Physics at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center, for all he's done to make this event possible. Now let's get to the participants of this evening's event. Our moderator, Richard Wolin, writes on 20th century European philosophy, and particularly the German philosopher Martin Heidegger and the group of thinkers known collectively as the Frankfurt School. Wolin graduated with a BA from Reed College, MA and PhD from York University in Toronto. He's taught at Reed, Rice University, and the Central European University, I believe, in Budapest. Since 2000, Wolin has been Distinguished Professor of Comparative Literature, History, and Political Science at the CUNY Graduate Center. His books have been translated into 8 languages. He's been a frequent contributor to the New York New Republic and Dissent. His book, Heidegger's Children, Hannah Arendt, Karl Lowith, Hans Jonas, and Herbert Marcuse, published by Princeton University Press, has been translated into 5 languages. His next book, Heidegger and Ruins Between Philosophy and Ideology, will come out early next year at the Yale University Press. Our speaker this evening, Alyza Lewin, is president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. She's also a co-founder and partner in Lewin & Lewin LLP, where she specializes in litigation, mediation, and government relations. She is a graduate of Princeton University and New York University's School of Law. Among other things, Ms. Lewis is the past president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. She has represented numerous high-profile clients, including victims of religious discrimination. In 2014, she orally argued a case before the U.S. Supreme Court that confirmed the constitutionality of a law granting American citizens who were born in Jerusalem the right to have the word Israel listed as the place of birth on their U.S. passports. Ms. Lewin began her law career in Israel, where she was law clerk to the deputy president of the Supreme Court of Israel. So at this point, I turn this over to Professor Wolin, who will lead and moderate this event. I hope you get a lot of it. I'm sure I will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manfred, for inviting me to take part in this event that I hope will be enrich everyone's understanding of the issues at stake. And I'm very happy to welcome Alyza Lewin to this colloquy, and I'm quite honored to be a participant in view of her past achievements and expertise on this subject. I think there's a lot to discuss. So just thank you, Alyza, for your virtual presence tonight. And perhaps we can get underway with a basic question about the mission statement of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law and how it evolved and what its tasks are today.
Sure. Thank you very much, Richard and Manfred. And and Kathy for inviting me to be here tonight. It's really a pleasure to join you and have this discussion with you. So yes, as Manfred mentioned, I'm president of a nonprofit called the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. It's a nonprofit that was established a little over 10 years ago by a civil rights lawyer named Ken Marcus. And we're not affiliated with Brandeis University. It's an independent nonprofit headquartered in Washington, D.C. And we basically use the law to combat anti-Semitism with a particular focus on university campuses. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and to promote justice for all. And so the topic that we're talking about today is one that I engage in every single day. I talk almost every single day to students on campuses or to faculty like yourself who share with me stories of their experiences on campus. And we at the Brandeis Center try to work to support and assist them. And we do that primarily by both educating university administrators and the general public to be able to understand and recognize all the contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, the way that anti-Semitism manifests today, and then to also educate administrators on their legal obligations to protect the members of their campus community from harassment and discrimination that targets them on the basis of their Jewish identity. And what we find is that when university administrators understand their legal obligation and are able to recognize the anti-Semitism that's taking place for what it is, then they usually act. When they don't, then sometimes we are forced to take legal action. And that's, the Brandeis Center does that too.
Mhm. And maybe you could give us an idea of the types of incidents you've been seeing on campus and how you begin to sort out the ones that need to be addressed and how to address them, and the role that the Brandeis Center can play in resolving these disputes.
Sure. So we see on campus, certainly, unfortunately, still the old traditional anti-Semitic tropes, the swastikas, the Nazi and white supremacist flyers and posters, the tropes that are accusing Jews of being all controlling, powerful, privileged. That still exists. You know, there still be stories of that students will share sometimes of others throwing pennies at them. But we also see a rise, a serious rise, in a new form of anti-Semitism that many people don't yet recognize as anti-Semitism. And what we see is an increased campaign, essentially, to marginalize and ostracize and actually push out and exclude Jewish students, particularly those for whom support for Israel is an integral part of their Jewish identity. So we see, for example, students who express any kind of pride in their ethnic heritage, right? Who celebrate the fact that Israel exists as the Jewish homeland, and who believe that Jews have a right to self-determination in some borders in their ancestral homeland. Those students are being pushed out, particularly from the progressive community. So if you have students who believe, as I say, that Israel has a right to exist, even if they are also very pro-Palestinian rights or they're supporting two states for two people, if they dare say that they believe Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish homeland, then they are told they're not welcome in clubs or at demonstrations that are pushing for all these issues that they hold dear, like women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigration rights, climate change, right? They're told they're not welcome. And worse, sometimes we see them actually pushed out of organizations they even helped found on these, that work on these and focus on these important issues.
How widespread are these problems, and what are some of the more serious and egregious manifestations to the point at which they rise to violation of established laws?
Sure. So we've seen things, for example, that have impacted individual students. So there were, for example, we saw and we represented the Brandeis Center at the University of Southern California, a student who had been elected as the vice president of student government. And there was, in the wake of the George Floyd riots, there had been at USC an Instagram account set up for students to anonymously discuss experiences where they may have been the victims of racism. And that account rapidly devolved into an attack on Zionists, because Zionism is racism. And this young woman, who was very progressive, supported, as I say, Palestinian rights together with believing in Israel as the Jewish homeland. She was a Zionist, and a campaign started on social media to impeach her Zionist ass. And it got to the point where there were students who actually went through the process to file a formal impeachment complaint, and the student government set up a date for this trial. And that's when the Brandeis Center intervened and sent a letter to the university informing them of their legal obligation, right? The truth is, student government today on campuses is really an educational opportunity. And we can talk about the basis for the university's legal obligation, but being forced out of her elected position purely because she is a Zionist was denying her this opportunity to which she was entitled to serve her term as the vice president. And the university, after receiving our letter, did make that impeachment trial go away. Mm-hmm. So, but there are incidents also at the at CUNY institutions, right? So we filed a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education about that had to do with Brooklyn College. And the Office for Civil Rights actually a couple of months ago opened up an investigation into our complaint at Brooklyn College. And what we found in Brooklyn College is that there were students who had complained, or told us, this was part of the complaint, that there were professors who had basically maligned them on the basis of their Jewish identity. They would endorse the narrative that Jews are white and privileged, and that therefore they contribute to systemic oppression of people of color. For example, in one class, there was a professor who stated that Ashkenazi Jews who immigrated to America have become part of the oppressors in this country. Even Jewish students of Hispanic descent, when they tried to articulate Jewish history and explain that Jews have faced anti-Semitism and discrimination and worse, they were also told that they, despite their background, should recognize that because they are Jewish, they are considered white, and that they are that they are oppressors. And when they would push back, the response was that they should get their whiteness in check, and that they needed to realize that they were still part of the dominant culture of white people who continue to perpetuate power structures. And when there was an assignment in class with students who were told to rank their identity, when a Jewish student explained that she didn't identify as white, she identified as Jewish, and so she ranked her Jewish identity higher than her white identity, She was disparaged and attacked by her classmates who said that this was, this was again her refusing to acknowledge what really was her identity. And so, we see now in this case is just an example of one of the things that we're seeing with greater frequency on campuses now today, which is that Jews are being accused in a way almost of this super whiteness. And there's a lack of understanding really of contemporary anti-Semitism and how it manifests. And so maybe one of the things that would make sense for us to do is to just kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about anti-Semitism and what anti-Semitism is and how it's manifested over the generations. And so how that would help us to understand anti-Semitism even today and these kinds of examples.
Right, I think that's a good idea. And at this point, along these lines, I'll acknowledge that the first question that's come up in our question and answer board has to do with the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, a sticky issue, but an important one. I mean, just listening to you speak, one can discern the increased level of vulnerability of Jewish students, why they are especially targeted and discriminated against for the, one can use no other word, racially, quote unquote, which anti-Semitism is a form of racism for their quote unquote whiteness. One of the ironies is, of course, that when one examines today, about 55 minutes ago, I happened to be tuning into CNN News. The last 5 minutes had a major segment on the Anti-Defamation League's recent report on the incidences of anti-Semitism in 2021, where in comparison to previous years, it's off the charts, or there are over 2,000 reported instances, and some of them are well known, and especially unfortunate. So there is unfortunately, as you indicated at the beginning, a history and a lineage that takes different forms at different times. If you specialize in the discourse of the far right and neo-fascism, etc., one notes that, of course, Jews are not considered white. They're excluded from the future, Aryan nation, the secessionist white nationalism ideology. So, I mean, which way do you want it? Of course, I'm saying that, half ironically, or maybe 3/4 ironically. So it would be useful, I think, indeed, to talk about some of these issues, especially the issue of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as an expression of anti-Semitism, because this sensitive topic clearly is at the basis of a lot of modern anti-Semitism, its virulence, and the hypocrisy of, certainly no one's denying that one should be free and open in one's ability to criticize the practices of the state of Israel or any other government. But of course, the selectivity here is somewhat mind-boggling. We can think of, right offhand, numerous other cases where, in fact, actual genocides or genocidal episodes are perpetrated, and these are ignored or passed over in silence. And often, I've been trying to read up on this in preparation for tonight, of course, the actions of Israel, whose right to self-defense, presumably, as would be true of any other nation state, is legitimate, and those issues are mammoth, as anyone who knows anything about the Middle East would readily acknowledge. The way the rhetorical inflation and excess, what strikes someone who tries to be open-minded, is that what it does is it precludes debate. There is no open-mindedness. It shuts down debate, and it devolves into something that's perhaps a hair's breadth away from name calling. And once that kind of rhetorical excess kicks in, there's no debate. So it's quite self-defeating. It might be gratifying in a certain sense, for the accuser to employ rhetoric, defamatory rhetoric of this nature, up the ante, as it were. But in terms of making one's position plausible and opening up forums of debate, it's counterproductive. The people you ideally would want to convince probably will be intimidated. So it's a very thorny and difficult issue.
Yes.
Let me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think so. I think what would be helpful in answering that is to first try and understand what anti-Semitism is, right? That's what I find. People are very frustrated. They say, why is it? And the students say, why is it? I know I'm experiencing what feels like harassment and discrimination. It's targeting me. And yet, why is it that the world, if anti-Semitism is society's oldest hatred, for goodness sake, why is it so hard for the society to actually recognize it when it's happening? And I think the reason it's so hard for people to recognize anti-Semitism, including the anti-Zionism that's anti-Semitism, is because anti-Semitism, while it may be our oldest hatred, it looks different in every generation. It morphs. It doesn't look the same. And that's one of the reasons why it's sometimes so difficult to recognize and understand anti-Semitism. There's one constant, however, about anti-Semitism. And the one constant about anti-Semitism is that no matter what the generation, no matter what era we're talking about, anti-Semitism always takes whatever is that society's greatest evil, whatever that generation viewed as its misfortune, and it pins it on the Jew. The Jew becomes the scapegoat. The Jew is the cause of the misfortune. The Jew is the reason. And so you could, right, we can go back to when the Jews were accused of killing Christ, or as you were saying, right, for the Nazis, the Nazis wanted a pure Aryan race, and the Jews were the ultimate race polluters. For communists, the Jews were capitalists. For when you talked about disease during the time of the Black Death, the Jews were the source of the disease, or the Jews were accused of poisoning the wells, right? These were justifications for pogroms, right, for violence against Jews. Or if not the violence, what anti-Semitism was used was to justify marginalizing the Jew, treating the Jew as the pariah, excluding them from society, or worse, right, expelling them from your land. But so if you think about the Holocaust, right, which I think when people today think anti-Semitism, that's the anti-Semitism they recognize, because that was the most recent defining anti-Semitic incident in our kind of collective recent historical memory, right? So people, when they see a swastika, they know now that's anti-Semitic. When they hear a Nazi or white supremacist, they know that's anti-Semitic. And people will acknowledge that if somebody who is very visibly, identifiably Jewish, either because of the way they dress, or because they are, for example, it's a synagogue and people are in the synagogue praying, and somebody comes in and opens fire on Jews in the middle of prayer, that they'll say that's anti-Semitic as well. But much beyond that, people don't understand anti-Semitism. But if you realize that this is what anti-Semitism does, it takes society's greatest evil and it pins it on the Jew so that then you exclude the Jew. For example, if you think about the Yellow Star of David that the Nazis had the Jews wear. The idea was you don't shop in the stores that are owned by those Jews. You don't engage, you don't use them as your professionals, your doctors, your lawyers. They are beyond the pale. They're to be excluded. So if that's what anti-Semitism does, then think about today. Think about what our society now, with the emphasis that our generation puts on human rights, what are the issues? What is viewed by our generation as our greatest evil today, that if you are fighting for justice, you must oppose? It's the issues of racism, apartheid, settler colonialism, right? Colonialism. These are the issues. Interesting that now there are groups that will not only pin that on the Jew, but suddenly the Jew, who for the Nazis were not white, right? As you said, they were the race polluters. Suddenly now the Jews are all white. Doesn't matter that we come from these diverse backgrounds. All Jews are white. All Jews are oppressors. All Jews are colonialists. All Jews are, right, privileged and powerful. And take it one more. It's not just individual Jews that are being blamed, but there are entities that are claiming that the world's worst offender of today's greatest evil, when you look at countries, right, are not the countries that we may think about who are guilty of different human rights abuses, whether it be China or Iran or Russia, or, right? No, that's not what they say. They say that the one Jewish collective, right, the Jewish homeland, the Jewish state of Israel, is the world's worst offender when it comes to society's greatest evil today. That is a form of contemporary anti-Semitism. Because if you realize that historic anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society, then what today's contemporary anti-Semitism seeks to do is to do that to the Jewish collective. It says to the one and only Jewish state, you alone are illegitimate since your inception. You alone have no right to exist. We are going to blame you for society's greatest evil in order to deny the Jewish state its place in the society of nations. That's today's contemporary form of anti-Semitism, and yet most people still don't recognize that as anti-Semitism. That's the anti-Zionism, right? The anti-Zionism is not turning around and saying, I don't agree with this policy of the current government of Israel, right? The IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, says explicitly, you can criticize Israel. Criticism that's similar to that leveled against any other country, that's not anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism is turning around and deciding that the one and only Jewish homeland is illegitimate since its inception, that it alone has no right to exist, applying to it a double standard that doesn't apply to anybody else. Why, right? Because what you're trying to do is deny only that Jewish collective its place in the society of nations. That's contemporary anti-Semitism. So, you know, you have a country full of people in Israel who criticize the policies of the government of Israel right and left. They're very good at that. You know, there's no shortage of that. But they're not anti-Semitic when they're doing that, right? And so that's the difference between the anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism. And what we see now today is that anti-Zionism, right, is setting up a litmus test for students and others, right, faculty, even beyond, right, because what happens on campus spreads beyond. But what's happening now is that expression of support for the existence of a Jewish homeland, right? What your position is on the policies of the current government of Israel is irrelevant. If you believe Israel has a right to exist, in most cases now we're seeing, if you believe Israel has a right to exist, then you are considered a pariah. We had at Tufts University, there was a situation where the Students for Justice in Palestine introduced a referendum, what they call the Deadly Exchange Campaign referendum. This is a campaign that seeks to blame Israel and Jews, or Jews who support Israel, for police brutality in America. That's what they say. They say that where did American police learn their discriminatory tactics and their aggression? They went on what are similar to kind of birthright trips for law enforcement to Israel, and that's where the Israelis train them. It's completely false. But there was Students for Justice in Palestine put together a booklet on this campaign. And in this booklet, that's supposed to be all about trying to combat police brutality in America and make the campus safe. There's a map. And this map is an interesting map because if you look at it, what's marked as occupied territories is not what is commonly referred to as the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. That's this area here, right? But what's marked as occupied territories is the Israel that is 1948 borders of Israel, right? Not the 1967 borders. And the whole thing is labeled as Palestine, right? And so one question is, what in the world is a map like this doing in a brochure about police brutality in America? What does it have to do with police brutality in America? It has nothing to do with police brutality in America. But what was happening is the groups that were endorsing this referendum were basically saying, look, if you want to be with us, and there were 43 groups that signed on to this referendum, representing essentially the entire progressive community on campus, they were basically saying, if you want to engage with us on fighting for social and racial justice in the United States, you have to accept this map. And, you know, I mentioned this map because, again, I'm to tie it into CUNY. There was a law student at CUNY Law School, Rafaela Guns, who had a very, very difficult experience. And ultimately, the situation got so bad that she left. She was pushed out. She essentially left the law school. But one of the stories that she tells is how she had seen somebody wearing a sweatshirt that had a map of Israel labeled as, you know, Free Palestine and All Palestine. And it's essentially this, I mean, it's not the exact same map, but the principle is the same idea as this map, that there's no place for Israel. Israel, and this goes back to what we were just saying about what about anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's when you say that Israel has no right to exist, that there's no place for the Jews to exercise their right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. If that's your feeling, that there are no borders where Israel can exist, then you have crossed that line. Then you're no longer criticizing Israel's policies in a constructive fashion, right? You're not trying to reform the policies of the current government of Israel. What you're trying to do is destructive. You're calling for the elimination of the one and only Jewish state.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues that comes up, I think it definitely plays a role in the Brooklyn College case that you were talking about a few minutes ago, is this growth of alliances on campus. Sometimes it's a phenomenon that's referred to as, I think, intersectionality that requires, and we see it in the public sphere too. For example, in the Women's March on Washington at the time of Trump's inauguration in January 2017, that for groups that are apparently interested in advancing the causes of freedom and self-determination, there is a specific kind of straitjacket, and the admission of discrimination in specific senses, unwillingness to unrecognize, as was the case in the Brooklyn College example, a history of Jewish victimhood or oppression. One doesn't have to go very far back at all in history to discern this. The level of intentional ignorance is quite prodigious here. But I think this phenomenon or problem, that is the types of alliances whereby other groups that identify with left-wing, kindred left-wing causes on campuses especially, feel a need to coincide or coalesce with extreme positions on Israel. And it's a very strange, again, a very strange and unfortunate form of groupthink and kind of intellectual straitjacket that shouldn't be occurring on campuses. Do we need to brutalize those we want to ally with us or those who are opposed to us in order to make our point? This is totalitarianism in miniature. It's not hard to recognize. This is a very unfortunate and worrisome, again, rhetorical aspect. And just one final thing I want to say, coming at these problems from another angle, a more historical angle, the relationship between rhetorical excess and rhetorical persecution and actual persecution, these are speech acts, and these are paradigms that are developed, and these paradigms become actually the templates for actual persecution. This isn't very hard to see in the development of racial anti-Semitism in the latter third of the 19th century and its evolution into political anti-Semitism, and then the actual acts of persecution, discrimination, at first legal, and this is, I think, in part well known. And you alluded to it before, the rhetorical and discursive devaluation of the other as preparation for actual physical discrimination and ultimately persecution and murder. The close tie between these rhetorical templates of anti-Semitism, et cetera, and today anti-Zionism, it's very worrisome and troubling on that level as well.
I think you're absolutely right. That progression, and there have been those who have studied whether it's the evolution of discrimination or the stages of genocide, right? How they move from the kind of the shunning, the negative verbal, as you say, right? The negative verbal statements. If you're repeatedly barraged, right, by this constant negative portrayal of a group of people, right, it escalates, right? If there's no pushback, if there's then it goes from first just that verbal articulation and the shunning, and then the actual discrimination to assault, violence, genocide. I mean, I don't have in front of me what each is, but that's what's been shown. I will say also, when you talk about historical, I think there have been periods in history where Jews have been viewed just as a religion and may have been persecuted as a religion. But Jews are not just a religion, right? Jews share more than a common faith. We share this sense of Jewish peoplehood. And society has historically had a certain discomfort with this more complex notion of what a Jew is, right? Because you can be Jewish and not practice, right? Not religiously observant. And what we see today is that Jews are being targeted on the basis of this shared ancestry and ethnicity, on the basis of our sense of Jewish peoplehood. And that's not new, right? If you go back, and I told folks, if you go back, for instance, and look at the debates in the French Parliament, when it was the first time that Jews were actually offered emancipation and equal rights in 1789, right? And you have the debates about whether or not the Declaration of Rights of Man should even apply to Jews. And you have the famous quote from the Count of Clermont-Tonnerre, right, where he says that the Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. And he goes on to say that if you can't pledge your allegiance just to France, we'll expel you. And a few years later, the same thing happened again in the Netherlands, where they debated the same issue about whether or not they should give citizenship to the to the Jews. And the idea was, well, if they're going to feel some allegiance to a Jew in England or Germany or France, how could we give them Dutch citizenship? So they wanted Jews to take an oath that started with, I so-and-so declare that I do not belong to any other people, nor any part of a people, but solely and only to the people of the Netherlands, right? This idea that somehow the Jews are part of the Jewish people is something that historically there's been pressure. And in fact, what happened at the time when the French said that is that there were members even of the Jewish community who said to their fellow Jews, don't mess this up, right? We've never been given equal rights before. And so you had folks who then came out and said, France is our Zion, right? They rapidly went to shed that. And so I think that part of what we need to do when you talk about the intersectionality and is we need to increase this understanding that Jews are a people, that we have this shared ancestry and ethnicity, and that Jews who celebrate our shared heritage, and that is deeply intertwined and interconnected with the land of Israel, right? If we celebrate that, for many Jews, I would say, when they celebrate that, that feeling, right, that Zionism, that connection to Israel is as integral to their Jewish identity for many as the Sabbath, as the Sabbath is integral to Jewish identity for some Jews. And when people say to me, wait, how could you say that Zionism is integral to Jewish identity when there are Jews for whom Zionism is not a part of their Jewish identity? And I answer that by saying, well, you know how many Jews there are who are not Sabbath observers, right? But if you ask any Jew who incorporates any kind of Shabbat observance into their life, and that is a very wide spectrum, obviously. But if you ask them why they do it, why they do whatever it is to designate Shabbat, or recognize Shabbat, they'll tell you that's because that's part of what it means to them to be Jewish. That's how they express their Judaism. By the same token, for those who express this connection or feel this connection to the land of Israel, they'll tell you that comes from their Jewish identity. And just like you don't yourself have to be a Sabbath observer to recognize that discriminating against or marginalizing or excluding against a Sabbath observer on the basis of their Sabbath observance is unlawful discrimination. By the same token, you don't yourself have to be a Zionist to recognize and appreciate that harassing or marginalizing or discriminating against a person on the basis of the expression of the Zionist part of their Jewish identity is also unacceptable. And so that's the education that I think we need to try and convey to these groups, that if what you are really talking about is wanting to make sure, right, today, what's the intersectional community saying? That you should be able to come to our table, no matter how radical your identity, and you will be accepted, right? That was you talked about the Women's March. There were the Dyke Marches in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. several years ago, where now the Dyke March is supposed to be, doesn't matter how extreme your identity, no matter how radical, we welcome you, right? Even more so, right? This is supposed to be the ultimate recognition of that. And yet what happened to the Dyke Marches in Chicago and in D.C. years ago? There were Jewish marchers who wanted to march with what's called the Jewish pride flag. It's a rainbow flag, which has the Star of David in the middle. And those marchers were told they could not display that flag. They were told if they wanted to wear a prayer shawl, a talit, or a skull cap, a yarmulke, that was fine. But they could not carry the Jewish pride flag. What is that? That's trying to say again, right? Your religion, your religious faith is okay, but this idea of Jewish peoplehood, that's where we draw the line. If you want to march in the Dyke March, you've got to, at a minimum, hide, but preferably shed this part of your Jewish identity that connects you to the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Think about how outrageous that is, right? There's no other group that's being charged that kind of price for admission to the Dyke March. So in today's society where we're saying, come, we will welcome you with our open arms, no matter how radical your identity, it is not acceptable that Jews should be the only identity who are told, no, but you have to shed this part of who you are before we will welcome you to our table. That's today's anti-Semitism.
Yeah. maybe in some of the time we have left, I think it would be helpful to talk about some of the constructive steps that the Brandeis Center has taken or envisions taking to combat, in addition to the some of the legal measures under Title VI that you've alluded to, the more broadly based kind of educational steps that one can take to counteract this the rise of this kind of prejudice that won't recognize itself as prejudice on campuses today.
Sure. So, so we've talked about Title VI. Why don't I will explain that a little bit. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to any entity that receives federal government funding. And that means pretty much every institution of higher education in the United States, certainly all public, but also pretty much almost every private university in the country. There's a small number, primarily some parochial schools, but a really fairly small number that are purely privately funded. But if you receive any kind of government funds, Title VI applies to you. And Title VI basically says that the recipients of these federal government funds may not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national, ethnic origin. And that's the condition upon which they receive the government funding. They're obligated then to make sure that all of their students are provided with an equal educational opportunity. They all have to have equal access to the various educational offerings provided by the universities. This was obviously initially designed and developed to protect against segregation, but now it's applies to all of these groups. Now, what's interesting is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act does not mention religion as a protected class. And after 9/11, this actually became an issue because there were members of faith-based groups that were experiencing some serious harassment and discrimination in educational facilities. There were Muslims, clearly after 9/11, and then there were Sikhs who were being mistaken for Muslims, who were suffering tremendous bullying. And so there were complaints, because what can happen with Title VI is you could either file a lawsuit in a court for a violation of Title VI, or what's more common is to go the administrative route and to file a complaint against a university with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which reviews the administrative complaints. And initially at that point, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights really wasn't sure that they even had jurisdiction to review the complaints filed by the members of the faith-based communities, because they said religion's not a covered category. Right. Ken Marcus, who I mentioned, was the founder of the Brandeis Center. This was before he had founded the Brandeis Center. He was serving for his first stint. He's actually served in this position twice, but as the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, which is the position that heads that Office for Civil Rights. And he said, no, members of faith-based groups are covered by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act when they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. In other words, they don't lose the Title VI protections that protect them from discrimination on the basis of race and national ethnic origin just because they also share a common faith. Right? Those protections still apply to them. So on that basis, he made it clear that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other faith-based groups. That was in 2004 that he actually issued a Dear Colleague letter saying that. And that was in the Bush administration. In 2010, during the Obama administration, that same approach was adopted by both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. They each also issued letters. So by 2010, you actually had both Democratic and Republican administrations expressing this understanding of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And then most recently in 2019, the executive order on combating anti-Semitism that raised this understanding of Title VI to the level of an executive order, applied it to all the government agencies. Every entity, every government agency that gives out federal government funds is now covered by Title VI. And the executive order made clear that when these agencies are investigating complaints alleging anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, the definition that's used to understand what anti-Semitism is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Because, right, as I say, many people still don't understand, what is national ethnic origin discrimination against Jews? What does that look like? What does that mean? Some people will say, and mistakenly so, will think that that's limited to people who will say, I'm not going to hire an Israeli. That's national origin discrimination. But national ethnic origin discrimination against Jews is broader than that. It is discrimination against Jews who celebrate, right, the Jews' shared ancestry and ethnicity. Those are the Jews for whom Zionism is integral to their identity as Jews. And I want to share with you, because when we talk about Zionism as integral to Jewish identity, I find it very useful to talk about and share the experience of the Ethiopian Jews. The Jews who were rescued actually by Israel in the 1980s, 1990s, airlifted and brought to Israel. These Jews, many people don't know that, these Jews lived in villages that were so remote from modernity that they actually, in 1980, had no idea that the Jewish temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. Now we're talking about the Jewish temple destroyed back in 70 AD. I mean, centuries. They had no idea. And they actually believed, when they were being rescued, that they would be able to visit the temple when they got to Jerusalem. And in fact, this yearning to come to Jerusalem and to be able to then visit the temple was a key part of their Judaism. In fact, it was something that was passed on by parent to child, from generation to generation. And what you find is that sometimes around Tisha B'Av, which is the day on the Jewish calendar that marks the destruction of the Jewish temples, you'll see there are articles written by Ethiopian Jews, because some of them will talk about how they actually experienced the destruction of the temple in their lifetime, because they came to Israel thinking they'd be able to go to the temple, and when they learned it was destroyed, they were devastated. So there was one woman who came as a child, Michala Vera Samuel, who a few years ago wrote an article. And if you just listen to this excerpt, then you'll be able to understand this Zionism. She writes here, how strong was our belief in the sanctity of Jerusalem in our homes in Ethiopia, the most powerful educational concept that resonated within children and adults alike in Ethiopia, passed down from generation to generation, was awareness of the need for us to safeguard the purity of our hearts and deeds in order that we would one day be worthy of entering Jerusalem, heaven on earth. The ideal of Jerusalem was the force that provided us with the stamina to persevere during the arduous trek through the desert. You have to realize they walked for days, for weeks. I mean, we talk about now the Ukrainian refugees who walked. They had to walk through the desert to get to be rescued. So it was the arduous trek through the desert. It was the dream that kept us going. We wanted to reach it, achieve it. We buried our beloved family members, left possessions behind willingly, and lost them to vicious thieves. We struggled to keep going despite the terrible conditions and the hunger, only because of our goal to reach Jerusalem of gold, and after so many generations, stand at the gates of the Holy Temple. So now just think about this for a minute. If they didn't know that the temple had been destroyed, they certainly had never heard of Theodor Herzl and political Zionism, which was developed in the late 1800s, right? That's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about here is this yearning to reach Jerusalem, this idea that this was the Jewish homeland, that this is where Jews belonged and would one day return to, right? That's the Zionism that's integral to Judaism, that's integral to Jewish identity for so many Jews. That's what the Ethiopian Jews were describing and represent. And that's the piece of Judaism that Jews today are being pressured to shed. And it's happening. I mean, you know, we talk about, there's this idea of erasive anti-Semitism now. This is what we see with so many of the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, where what happens is programs that were designed to try and ameliorate bias and discrimination by sensitizing the community, educating the community, whether it's university communities or workplace, you know, corporations. Many of these programs don't talk about Jewish identity at all. So they talk about other disadvantaged groups, but not Jews. So there's no discussion about, right, society's oldest hatred. There's no discussion about anti-Semitism. But many of these programs, it's even worse than that, because if there is a discussion of Jewish identity, it's like we saw in the Brooklyn College case, or we have a case at Stanford University. The way Jews are depicted are as the powerful, privileged, controlling, white oppressors, colonialists. But if you think about that, that image is synonymous with the anti-Semitic image of the Jew as all powerful and controlling. And so what's happening is these DEI programs, which are supposed to eliminate bias and discrimination, are actually fostering very negative, hostile feelings towards Jews. And so the absence of Jewish identity there, right? Jewish identity being erased, it's not part of that. We see that not only in the DEI programs, but we see where it may not be deliberate. We do see a deliberate erasing of Jewish identity by those, for instance, who try to suggest that there is no Jewish history in Israel or in Jerusalem, right? The idea that there was never, those who will suggest there was never a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, or that Jews are Judaizing Jerusalem. That's erasing Jewish history. And why do they erase Jewish history? Right? They erase Jewish history because you can't call Jews settler colonialists if you realize that Jews are actually indigenous to Judea, right? If you acknowledge the indigeneity of the Jews to Judea, that they're not colonialists. So that's why there's this deliberate attempt to erase our Jewish history, our historic Jewish history, our sense of Jewish peoplehood, our history of harassment and discrimination and genocide or worse against Jews. All of that gets erased. It doesn't exist. And then what happens? If you have people who have the audacity to push back and who still have the courage to speak up and say, wait a minute, I'm a Jew and I'm proud of my identity. I'm a Jew and I celebrate my shared ancestry and ethnicity. I believe that Jews have a right to self-determination in our ancestral homeland. What happens to you? You get shunned, you get marginalized, you get canceled, you get excluded, right? You get demonized. Our enemies, right? The enemies of the Jewish people have realized you don't need a genocide to destroy the Jewish people. You ignore and erase our history, our sense of Jewish peoplehood, and then you shame and pressure anybody who wants to say otherwise so that you pressure them into silence. That's the way. That's the way we try and erase the Jewish community. That's today's anti-Semitism. That's what's taking place today. And that's what we have to fight against.
Very good. Maybe we have time to address one more, because we're kind of getting toward the end of our hour. One more issue or question. One matter I wanted to ask you about was the Jigsaw program at the Brandeis Center, and maybe you could tell us what that involves. It tries to be more proactive and constructive than you know, which is
Sure.
valuable.
We have a program which we call our Jigsaw Fellowship. It's a long acronym that stands for Justice Initiative Guiding Student Activists Worldwide. But what it is we train a select group of law school students who are interested in this area. We teach them the areas of law they need to understand in order to effectively combat the anti-Semitism that we see today. So we teach them not only about the anti-discrimination laws like Title VI, we teach them the First Amendment issues. We teach them about the principles of academic freedom. We teach them some international law issues that as they may apply to Israel. And the idea is that then these law students are, they work with and help guide and mentor undergraduate students who are confronting anti-Semitism. It used to be that most of the anti-Semitism that we saw was on the undergraduate campuses. Now we see it more frequently actually too on some of the graduate school campuses and the law schools, like NYU recently at the law school. Just tonight, there was an event at Georgetown University Law School with Mohammed El-Kurd, who is a known anti-Semitic speaker. So now we actually find ourselves also working with Jigsaw Fellows, working with law students. But what we had found is that there were students who sometimes would be too intimidated to speak with lawyers. They mistakenly, I think that if you talk to a lawyer, that means you may find your name in neon lights and end up with some major lawsuit in your name. That's not, and we should go back for a second to talk about how Title VI works. What happens is, and we encourage students who experience, or faculty, I would say, who experience anti-Semitism to come and to reach out to the Brandeis Center. You can reach us at info@brandeiscenter.com is the general email. And what we'll do is we will work with you, right? Our goal is to try and, as I say, educate the universities, to try and get the universities to change, preferably voluntarily. Like, we'd like them to take steps to address the hostile climate on campus on their own. If they won't, then sometimes it might become necessary to file a complaint, but complaints that are filed with the Office for Civil Rights can be filed completely anonymously. It's possible for the Brandeis Center to file these complaints on behalf of students. We have filed complaints where students have remained anonymous witnesses in the complaints. So what I would recommend is, if you feel you have experienced anti-Semitism or you're looking for guidance, reach out to us. We can help guide you, advise you as to next steps. Sometimes those might involve students talking to administrators. It might involve the Brandeis Center reaching out to administrators, or in some cases, it might be that it gets to the point where it's necessary to file formal complaints. But that is the Jigsaw program. If you're interested in being one of those law students that gets trained, you should also reach out to us, and you can apply for that position as well. One other item, which I think, and it's another quote, but I think it's important, and I think it's important for the community to know, and so I just want to make sure we touch on it, is that students and faculty should understand, right, that Zionism doesn't preclude coexistence. And there are certain allegations that are made today that border on blood libels, right? They're modern day blood libels. So the historic blood libels were the allegations. We've just now finished the Passover holidays, right? So the historic blood libel was that Jews killed babies, Christian babies, to use their blood in the matzah for the holiday. Again, lies that were told in order to justify violence against Jews and mistreatment of Jews. And we see that happening now again, right? We see these distortions being told again in ways that are being used to justify the marginalization or the mistreatment of Jews. So, for instance, the allegation that Israel's responsible for ethnic cleansing. If you look at the census and the number of Muslims, for instance, who were living in Jerusalem in 1967. So 1967 is when Israel acquired the additional territory after the Six-Day War in 1967. That's when East and West Jerusalem were united. So living in Jerusalem in 1967, there were 54,963 Muslims at that point in 1967. The latest numbers that I find, most recent numbers, are in 2016. At that point, there were 319,800 Muslims living in Jerusalem. So the difference between approximately a little less than 55,000 and a little less than 320,000, that's what, over five times the number, whatever that is. That's not ethnic cleansing, right? There is no ethnic cleansing taking place. As we said, the idea of calling the Israelis and Jews colonialists, you can only call them settler colonialists if you erase Jewish history and don't refuse to recognize the Jews' indigeneity to the land. But then one of the other lies that's told is this notion that Zionism somehow means that the land was supposed to be cleansed of Arabs. That's not at all the case. And there was, and that's why I really like this quote, there was a speech that Chaim Weizmann gave in 1937. Chaim Weizmann was the very first president of the brand new state of Israel in 1948 when it was created, but he was also a leader in the Zionist movement, the political Zionist movement, right? He was, and so in 1937, Chaim Weizmann spoke at what was then the 20th Zionist Congress. And here's a little excerpt from his speech. He says, "Permit me at this historic juncture to say a word to the Arab people. We know that the Mufti of Jerusalem, this was Haj Amin al-Husseini, and then there was another Nazi collaborator who was Fawzi al-Kawkawji. He says, we know that they are not the Arab nation. In the present world, those who have bombs and revolvers at command wield political power. But in the history of a nation, their life is like one day, even if it extends over years. There is an Arab nation with a glorious past. To that nation, we have stretched out our hand and do so even now, but on one condition. Just as we wish them to overcome their crisis and to revert to the great tradition of a mighty and civilized Arab people, so must they know that we have the right to build our home in Eretz Yisrael, that means the land of Israel, harming no one, helping all. When they acknowledge this, we shall reach common ground, and I hope for the time when we shall once more recognize each other." So if you're trying to understand what even political Zionism was all about in 1937, before the state of Israel was created, it was about coexistence. Here you had Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel, saying, let's live side by side, coexistence. He was asking then for the same thing that Israel's asking for now, coexistence. That's what Zionism is.
Very, very well said. And I think it's a good constructive note on which to end our discussion. And just let me thank you again, Alyza, immensely for your willingness to present tonight. And I think it was extremely helpful and provided a lot of food for thought and clarification. Hope to see you again sometime soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay.
All right. Thank you, friends, for joining us. We're gonna let our friends go, and we appreciate. And this recording will be available on the CAFE website starting tomorrow, so everybody can log back in and see all of the upcoming events, including the event on May 5th, discussing these topics again. So please come back to us on May 5th, and we'll be excited to welcome you.
Thanks
you.
also from me. I thought this was a great event. Wonderful, wonderful conversation. Very illuminating. Thanks so much.
Thank you.